I remember going to see you in action opposite Richard Dawkins.
That is palpably anti-scientific.
Jesus actually claimed to be the Logos that created the whole universe. Making water into wine is really a triviality. Several letters from people that began their journey to faith in God that particular night.
I seem to remember one or two occasions you've spoken of people perhaps thought you had to make a choice.
Come to my room. You give up your naive faith in God.
Behind the Iron Curtain in the USSR.
I could lecture in Russian in those days. And afterwards they would say, we hear you believe in God. Why? I was invited to debate with Christopher. The new Europe should prefer the new atheism. The new Europe was created by the fall of an atheist worldview. It has been a great pleasure to get to know Ayan a little, the reality of what God has done in her life.
A very personal journey she's been on.
God is a person, not a theory. The last month, I heard a crash at 4 o'clock in the morning in the hotel. My wife was lying on the floor and I thought she was dead. In those moments, I had complete peace that I'd see her again. And that's what you'd expect if it's true. The key is to learn to trust him and follow him as the light of this world, and that light is very bright.
Hello, welcome along to today's conversation. I'm Justin Brierley. I'm with John Lennox here in the beautiful surroundings of Yarnton Manor, Oxford. John is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Oxford University. He's the author of many books on science, faith and technology, and his latest book is God, AI and the End of History, Understanding the Book of Revelation in an Age of Intelligent Machines. Today I'm going to be talking to John about his life, his ministry, many years defending the intellectual case for God against some of the world's best-known atheist thinkers. John, thank you for joining me.
It's a great pleasure, Justin.
What a wonderful place to do this as well.
It's magnificent. Yeah. It's got a huge sense of history and intellectual history as well.
Absolutely, yes. We're not far from where some of the great intellectual giants of literature, science, philosophy, and of course C.S. Lewis have all been here in Oxford. You've debated here at Oxford University over the years. I remember going to see you in action opposite Richard Dawkins. I think this was in 2008, and it was that wonderful debate you had at Oxford's Natural History Museum. I seem to remember a towering T-Rex behind you both, creating a sort of imposing background to the conversation on God and science that you had. What do you remember of that night when you were face to face with probably the world's best known atheist, Richard Dawkins?
Well, being equally terrified of Dawkins as of the T-Rex, because it appeared to be rather precariously balanced between us. And Dawkins was in a pretty fierce mood that evening, as you recall. And it's intimidating, of course, to meet someone with that kind of reputation. But as I'd said to him on a previous debate, because that was our second major debate, in the first one, he told me, but he didn't really debate. Now, whether he meant people like me or full stop, I'm not sure. But I said, well, I am going to try to combat your atheism with what I hope is a rational interpretation of the facts in the name of Christianity, and let the audience judge. And he said, well, I'll buy that. So I went in with that attitude. But it was a fairly complex debate. It was difficult because the moderator took a very light hand with it. And that's a bit difficult when you find yourself under the pressure of an absolute onslaught, which it was, coming from Dawkins. But nevertheless, it's interesting looking back. I had several letters from people that began their journey to faith in God that particular night.
That's really interesting. I have memories of that night also because as I was leaving the venue and heading towards the Oxford College where the sort of after show party was taking place
Yes.
to grab a few interviews. Who should sidle up next to me pushing his bike but Richard Dawkins? And so we ended up having a conversation en route to the venue, and that enabled me to actually record a brief sort of interview with him there. And again, this was the heyday, I would say, of New Atheism. Dawkins had just published his book a couple of years before, The God Delusion, very well known. You were beginning to write responses at that time yourself. And you went on to, over the following years, to have on-stage debates with a number of the leading atheist thinkers. I mean, do you sense that was needed at that time, a sort of someone like you to be on stage with these minds at a time when the God question was sort of being debated in those kinds of public spaces?
I'm not sure I put it quite that way because I didn't seek it. I was sought. That some people felt that the so-called New Atheists had too much of the limelight and there wasn't enough pushback. And I was invited to do it, and that's how I ended up doing it. It was not coming from me. But I should mention that looking back on that night, I regret so much that I hadn't genned up properly on one particular issue. I don't know whether you remember, but when I arrived at the Natural History Museum for the debate, I suddenly recalled, as best I could recall, that the actual museum had been built with the proceeds from the Oxford University Press's production of the Bible, and had been dedicated to the glory of God in his creation. I checked with the staff and nobody had ever heard of it. And I knew that Dawkins had worked in the building. And so I risked during the debate to mention this, but I hadn't checked it. And I said, is this building associated? And Richard said, absolutely not. It's got nothing to do with it whatsoever. And of course, afterwards, when I looked it up, it had everything to do with it. And I just felt it was a pity that I hadn't been clear about that. But hindsight's 2020, you know.
Absolutely. We've all had those moments when we wish we'd said that thing. But having said that, John, what I've always appreciated, and I know you'll be embarrassed for me saying this, but is you brought to all of those debates that I watched over the years opposite your atheist counterparts, not just an intellectual rigor, but also a personability and a warmth, which I think is also extremely important to keep these things human rather than just
absolutely, and that is deliberately modelled on the way Christ treated people. The only people he was really angry with were bigoted religious people, but everyone else he listened to, he asked questions, and I could see very early on, and it's partly because I come from Ireland. I'd seen a lot of fractious pseudo-Christianity and what bitterness does, and even sectarian violence, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And I resolved even as a teenager, because I was getting interested in this whole area of the intellectual defense of Christianity, that I would always, as far as possible, pursue peace and friendliness, because it seemed to me to be the only way really to get at truth, rather than just bandy about opinion with violent emotions associated with it.
Wonderful. Take us back to growing up in Northern Ireland. What were some of the influences on you as you began to both explore a calling into science and academia, but also the growing faith you had?
Well, my parents, really very formative. Dad and Mum, who'd never had much of a formal education. My mother had more than my father. She actually taught shorthand and typing and practical business type subjects. Dad was refused an education. His father just said, we've a shop to run and you're going to have to run it with your brother. They would have given his right hand. He was a person who much preferred to be immersed in a serious book of theology than looking after the shop. And so, in a sense, he lived life through me and gave me every opportunity to go to Cambridge and so on. But there were key things in their lives that stood out. Two in particular. One, their attitude to other people. And that was seen in the fraught and fragile situation in Northern Ireland of sectarianism, where the business eventually, the shop, was the subject of pretty violent IRA attacks and bombs, one of which nearly killed my brother. But earlier on, I could see, because I knew the staff in the shop, I went in often because they had a lovely coffee bar, actually the only one in town. And I could see that my dad employed both Catholics and Protestants. And that was a risky thing to do. The city was very divided, polarized. And I asked him why he did it. And he said that he read in Scripture, in Genexis, that all men and women, irrespective of their worldview, were made in the image of God. And I never forget how he rounded off his statement. He said, I intend to treat them like that. Now that burned its way into my mind, and I tried as best I could, but he lived it, you see, and paid for it. The second thing was, and it was equally important, they loved me enough to allow me to think. And although they were strongly convinced Christians, they were convinced on the basis of Scripture and evidence, and they opened up the biblical world to me in a mind-expanding way. Never have occurred to me that Christians were bigoted, certainly, but there were plenty around, but not my parents, because it led to history and all this kind of stuff, and they encouraged me to read very widely, even way outside Christianity. And many people have heard the story where Dad gave me a book once, nice. I said, what is it? And he says, it's a Communist Manifesto. I said, have you read it? He said, no. But you should read it. Why? You need to know what other people think. Now, that was highly enlightened in that kind of a, often, sadly, very parochial society and culture in Northern Ireland. And so they loved me. They'd love to see me become a Christian. It was quite clear to me, even as a child, that I had to become a Christian. I wasn't born one. I was born a creature of God, but not in that sense a child of God. And they gave me space to think. And the result of that was that when I left home to go to university in England, I didn't jettison my faith in God because I had grounds for it. Whereas so many of my contemporaries, they'd had it forced on them. And the moment they got out of house, that was the end of religion for them. So those were bedrock things. And perhaps there's a third one worth mentioning, and it has to do with morality and ethics again, the value of human beings. That when Dad, he believed in discipline, and occasionally, in his view, and in ours, he went over the top. He would apologize to us as children. I never forget that. And what that got across was, here's a parent who feels there's a standard outside of him, that he's not the absolute standard to which he must conform, and if he doesn't, he'll even apologize to his children. Now that I didn't hear of in connection with other kids. So those things, their Christianity was lived, it was real, it had ethical and moral and spiritual impact.
And gave you the foundation for, obviously, when you did launch your own academic career, you went to Cambridge, you started studying mathematics, and obviously went into your own academic career and obviously ended up as a professor at Oxford. To what extent did you encounter a lot of skepticism from your student peers and then the professors that you were with?
Well, because of my father, he got very much into C.S. Lewis. He used to keep copies of Mere Christianity in the glove compartment of his car to give to hitchhikers, which was something that happened in those days. And I devoured Lewis. And partly because I've never known what it is to be an adult and an unbeliever. I've been an adult and a skeptic. I've been a skeptic all my life. That's how I've learned so much, in a way, because I've asked questions. I've questioned my faith in God and its grounds. I got into Lewis, and Lewis led to all kinds of other things. So before I even landed in Cambridge, I'd read a lot of books on the intellectual defense of Christianity. So I hit the ground running. And I remember at the very first meeting, it was a Christian union, they called it a freshers' squash, an awful name, where some local Christian introduced the Christian faith to the students. And I went in full sail because I didn't think he was very convincing and made a lot of non-Christian friends from the get-go. And they remained friends, and I got into the thick of it. And I think what was behind that, Justin, was I had a very clear conviction, not that Christianity was a helpful religion, but it was true. It was the truth. And the idea, as Jesus himself put it in a very profound statement, I am the truth. Not just I speak true things, of course that was the case, but I am the truth. There's an ultimate truth. And therefore, I would defend that. I would try and do good mathematics. But I wasn't going to compromise that belief in truth. But what I was going to do was get to know people, usually by playing Socrates and asking questions, who did not share my worldview. And I've been doing it ever since.
I seem to remember one or two occasions you've spoken of where that happened, at high table as a sort of Oxford scenario where people thought you had to make a choice between your faith and being a intellectual.
There's one famous occasion, but that wasn't in Oxford, it was in Cambridge. Although it happened many times in Oxford to a greater or lesser degree, but this was a greater degree. This was my first meeting with the Nobel Prize winner at a feast, a lovely meal, and I never met one before. So I chatted to him like Socrates would have done, I hope, asked him about his work. And he was waxing eloquent about this brilliant piece of work that had won him the Nobel Prize. And I said, while you were doing this, did it ever occur to you that there might be a mind behind the universe and behind these mechanisms? And his demeanor changed instantly. He didn't like the question and he said no, and it struck me that he was dodging it. And that was the finish. He just turned to his neighbour, didn't speak to me again for the rest of the meal. But after the meal, he said, "Lennox, come to my room." It was no invitation. And I went, and to my amazement, found several other senior members of the university and the college there. And it's hard for me to recall exactly what happened, but what I seem to recall is sitting down while they stood. That's with me. And he said, "Lennox, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he said, "In front of witnesses tonight, you give up your naive faith in God, because I want to tell you that if you pursue this, you'll never make it. You'll suffer in comparison with your peers, and you just get nowhere. So give it up and hear the witnesses." It was incredible pressure. I remember later thinking, if it had been the other way round, and he'd been a Christian, I'd been an atheist, he'd have probably lost his college post or university post the next day. But such is the way things are. It taught me a great deal. So I summoned up courage and I said to him, "Tell me," I said, "what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got in Christ?" Well, he said, "The evolutionary philosophy of Henri Bergson." Well, you see, I'd read Lewis, and I knew about Bergson and his élan vital and things like that. I didn't go into it. It was a very bad choice because actually Bergson revealed that he would have converted to Catholicism had it not been for certain doings of the Vatican during the Second World War. So it wasn't a good choice. But I didn't know that then. I just looked at him very straight and I said, "If that's all you've got to offer me, then I'll risk it and stick with Christ." And I got up and walked out. That was a profound experience for a 19-year-old. And it taught me many things. First, there's an unacceptable side of academia, browbeating. And I resolved if ever I got a position, I never dreamed I would get a professorship anywhere, let alone at Oxford. I'm never going to do that. That is the worst kind of way to treat someone. And secondly, I'm going to be prepared to stick my neck out in a friendly way, not in this kind of way. So my mind was teeming with all kinds of things. But looking back, I think it probably formed a pretty serious turning point. And in a way, meeting Dawkins, who wasn't a Nobel Prize winner, by the way, was smaller beer.
Right. It gave you a good grounding, yes, to see people
it,
in that way.
It did more than that. I didn't talk about it much at the time, I don't recall, but it just did something. Let's say it put some kind of steel into me that showed that you can rationally stand for the Christian faith, and there are people that are going to try and browbeat you with science or something.
Yeah. As well as Cambridge and Oxford, your life, academic work, and speaking ministry has taken you all over the world. What people are less familiar with, I think, is some time that you spent actually behind the Iron Curtain in the USSR, in Eastern Europe, especially sort of engaging your intellectual peers in those places, but obviously in a place where, you know, Christianity was almost, you know, outlawed at some level. What were some of the experiences you remember from that very unique experience?
Well, there are two separate things. During the Cold War, I traveled a lot to Eastern Europe, mainly East Germany, because I was fluent in German, and that's another story in itself, and Hungary and Poland. And in each of these three countries, I spoke German. Now, how that opened up is a very long story, and I'm about to publish my autobiography because the story has never been told really, except in little fits and bursts. But most of those early days, from 76 onwards, I suppose until nearly 1989, was not engaging with the intellectuals in those countries. It was actually Bible teaching, because, as you say, communism had squashed a lot of the life out of potentially bright Christians getting involved in Christian ministry. Because, particularly in East Germany, young people who made any kind of Christian profession and refused to take the Marxist oath of allegiance to an atheistic state could not receive education beyond the age of 13. That was intellectual murder, in my view. And I went mainly to encourage them by expounding scripture in such a way that they could see that you can take this stuff seriously and you can be confident in it. And that wasn't among the intellectuals mainly, it was amongst ordinary people. And it taught me a lot. Sometimes in villages in up at the Erzgebirge in East Germany, where they had the uranium mines and the workers would die very young, and it was in many other homes. But typically I'd go into a village and maybe the village was a couple of thousand people and I'd get 500 people come and hear me speak. And I learned a lot from these humble folks who had forfeited often education. They were bright people, but they weren't allowed. They'd just be told, even if they'd been top in the school. One girl in particular, I was actually in her home when she came in from school weeping. She'd been the brightest girl of the class every year. And she came in weeping while I was there with a friend. And she said, I've been told that I cannot have any more education. I've been told to go and work in the slipper factory. And I remember saying to her, Esther, what did you say to the teacher? Now she was 15, and we were astounded at her answer. She said to the teacher, sir, one day you will stand before God and you will answer for what you've done to me today. Gosh. We all wept.
Yeah.
It was so moving. And incidentally, although it's nothing to do with the story, I conducted the marriage between her and her husband in an East German context. I expect I'm one of the relatively few Irish people who've conducted 2 wedding services in German, one in the West and one in the East. But those things teach you what atheism becomes when it invades a culture. And in a way, it prepared me to meet Dawkins, who really knows very little about applied atheism.
True. What do you think brought about this era, though, that we've come to call the New Atheism?
Yeah, well,
Thousands.
I only partly answered your last question. I went on the side of ordinary folks and I was expounding scripture. The big change for me came in 1989 when the wall fell. And here again, it's a very long story, but all during these years, I'd been learning Russian and translating Russian mathematics into English because it wasn't paid enough. And little knowing that when the turning point came in 1989, I was about to go to Russia. And then it was all change. This was into the intellectual arena in the academies of science and universities and so on. And that then, of course, was very early days, but the new atheism always was the old atheism. And I encountered a lot of it in Russia, and they just could not imagine how a mathematician trained at Cambridge possibly could believe in God. And so what happened quite frequently was I give a mathematics seminar in a university, and they would be polite. I could lecture in Russian in those days on my field, not on just anything, but on my field, I could do that. And it opened every door, of course, for me, because not so many people could do that. And afterwards they would say, well, can we ask you other questions? And I said, sure. We hear you believe in God. Why? And you spend an hour in a math seminar. That would never happen in Oxford, Cambridge, or anywhere in the United States, but it happened in Russia again and again. And I got the opportunity to go on a Royal Society exchange to, well, it was just the end of the Soviet Union then, to the academies of science in Russia. And I went for 2 months so that Russian mathematicians could come back to the UK, because they were brilliant in my field, the Russians. And the agreement was that if I went for a week, a Russian could come for 1 week, and it was very strict. Now, this is another long and fascinating story where I believe God directly intervened. But anyway, I went for 2 months, mostly to Siberia. And there, the possibility of interacting with serious-minded people who were atheists. And I'll tell you one story about that. They forced me to speak Russian. I learned a lot very rapidly, and invited me into their homes, their little flats, almost every night of the week. And their linguistic capacity was pretty well nil. It had to be Russian or nothing else. So hands and feet and trying my best. And once I tried German and they were scared stiff. I remember a Russian saying to me, you ought not to be able to speak German like that.
Wow.
I'll never forget that. So I stuffed. It was something to do with the memory of the war, you see.
Yeah.
So I remember one night being in the home of a very bright mathematician. I met all kinds of dissidents that had been in the Gulag. One very amusing evening. I said, you don't seem to resent being in the Gulag. Oh, he said, no, all the brightest people were there. It was the best university. But he said, don't go there now. They're all criminals.
Wow.
I'll never forget that. But in that setting,
Yeah.
I met some very bright people. And one night I was in the home of an applied mathematician. And at the end of the evening, he said, everybody here knows me well except our guest. And he said, tonight, I have heard arguments to which I have no answer. I used to think that Christianity was for old people who wanted some kind of crutch, but not for intellectuals, and certainly not for university professors. But he said, he turned to me, you must give me time. Nothing that I've been taught enables me to cope with this kind of reasoning.
Gosh.
Which was fascinating. And I learned, and afterwards I noticed it because I looked for it, that in fact, a lot of their education had been simple rote learning. It wasn't training to think. They hadn't been taught to think. And in later years, I actually got involved in their education, but that's another story. It's too big for this conversation, I think.
But when it comes to then the form of atheism that you've interacted with in the West largely, which has not been, as it were, that politicized sort of institutional atheism of communist Soviet states, what have you tended to encounter there? And is there any overlap? Because were those folk you were interacting with in Eastern Europe, were they under the impression that science is in conflict with God and those sorts of tropes that the new atheists have frequently?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. But they'd no rationale behind it.
Did you encounter any more rationale in your Western counterparts when?
I suppose I did, because some of them had been afraid to think. I'm not sure that all of them had been, but the new atheism was an aggressive phenomenon, marked by aggression, and that's why it faded, I think, largely, as you have very well documented in your writing. But it was aggressive for a time and whipped up aggression, because its leaders really believed that this was the way to flatten religion and get rid of it. It was a very serious mistake. Even from an elementary practical point of view, you don't get anywhere by inspiring hate, basically, and ridicule. It's not the way to deal with intelligent people. But all of this that I had learned was in the background when suddenly you get the arising of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and the others. And it was very, very good background. I mean, one thing that illustrated this was I was invited to debate with Christopher Hitchens, to my great surprise, at the opening of the Edinburgh Festival, the very first thing, in the Usher Hall, packed out. And the motion, I couldn't believe this, was the new Europe should prefer the new atheism. Now think about it. The new Europe is what was created by the fall of communism. Communism was absolutely founded on Marxist atheism. And I thought, I don't believe this. I don't believe this. And I remember that night, and Dawkins was in the audience, and he very kindly wrote on his website before the debate that he was coming to see Christopher Hitchens crucify me. Well, Christopher Hitchens, by common consent, lost the debate, the first in his life. I remember James Naughtie, the eminent BBC commentator, he moderated it. And at the beginning, they came to me and said, are we going to have a vote? I said, up to you. I said, I'm not interested in a vote. Oh, we must have a vote, said Naughtie. Christopher, we must have a vote, you see. And at the beginning, Naughtie said, roughly, how many people agree with this proposition? The hands went up. And afterwards, he did the same. And there were significantly fewer hands went up. And Naughtie said, shall we recount? And Christopher Hitchens had the grace to say, no, Lennox has it. And I remember I went over and shook his hand, you see, and he whispered to me, he said, I want another debate, no voting. But the irony of it was, at the end of the debate, I was simply able to say, the irony of this whole notion is that the new Europe was created by the fall of an atheist worldview. Do we want to build the wall again? And that was the final statement. Right. So those encounters with the new atheists are memorable, somewhat whimsical, but it was the aggression and a lot of showmanship. Not indeed. Much with Richard, but with
With
Christopher.
Christopher Hitchens, absolutely, he was a rhetorician. He was someone
He was, yeah.
enjoyed the public stage and so on. I've often heard, I don't know if this was your experience or perhaps you've only met him on one or two occasions, that he was actually quite affable and friendly in personal terms with his...
When I first met him, I'm sure he'll forgive me, he's no longer with us, but he was propping up a bar in Edinburgh. And he looked at me, John Lennox, nice to meet you. And I looked him straight in the eye. And I said, you are a contrarian, aren't you? And his eyes widened open. He said, how did you know? I said, I read your book. And he totally changed. He became friendly, open. He said, you read my book? I said, of course. But he said, I haven't read yours. Well, I said, that doesn't matter. But I said, I got a question for you. I said, you get your arguments all from more or less one source. And he said, what was that, Thomas Paine? He said, you're right. You're right. So we got on like a house on fire. And I realized that the rhetoric and so on, that behind the scenes he could hold a very lovely conversation. I actually liked him.
Yeah.
The problem came when he drank a bit too much, and then it could get difficult. But I think Christopher would have debated me all around the United States, you know, because we did have a second go at it. And I remember that very well because he quoted, he was no scientist, of course, he hadn't a clue, and he quoted the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher on David Hume, saying that Hume had nailed the whole concept of miracles and the supernatural. And I was very forthright in the debate, and I said, that's nonsense, Christopher, and I can explain that to you very simply, and I did. And afterwards, we had a meal together. He said, you were a bit hard on me about Hume. I said, but you talked nonsense. And I said, I know where you got the nonsense. He said, where? I said, Dawkins. You should stop listening to him because he hasn't a clue about Hume. So we had those kind of interactions, which were quite endearing, really.
I often wonder where he would sit now in, you know, he died, I think, in 2011.
I think he knows the truth now.
Well,
yes,
absolutely.
but I understand what you're saying.
But you know, because as you said, the New Atheism did wane, and it's so interesting to see now, for instance, someone who was a great friend of his, you know, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, coming to faith.
Yeah,
herself.
absolutely.
And when arguably the most famous female atheist in the world comes to faith, I wonder how her great friend Christopher Hitchens would have received that and what
I think there are indicators in the past. The man that organized most of these debates for me, Larry Taunton of Birmingham, Alabama, got to know Hitchens very well and went on a road trip with him. You may not know this. And it was a long road trip. And he asked Christopher to read out loud in the car the Gospel of John, which Hitchens did. And Larry interacted with Hitchens quite a lot and actually wrote a book called The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, which was lambasted by, sadly, the British press who'd never read it. It's a very interesting book. And Hitchens on one occasion is on record as saying, if every Christian in the USA were like Larry Taunton, this world would be a very different place. Now, in his towards end of life, he was cared for by the director of the National Institute of Health himself, Francis Collins, who is a Christian believer. And that very fact would indicate to me that Christopher was beginning certainly to rely on and be friendly with a string of Christian believers. I suspect that Ayaan's conversion to the Christian faith would have had a huge impact on him. It doesn't appear yet to have had such an impact on Richard Dawkins. The interview is very interesting, though. Richard starts by saying, Ian, come on, you don't really believe this stuff about Jesus being God incarnate and walking on water. He likes ridiculing that. He did it with me. And I said to him that if Christ as God become human and he created the universe walking on water, ain't a big deal. I don't know how he really thought about that. But at the end of the interview with Ian, which is well worth watching, he says, you do believe it. And Ian does believe it. And she, I believe, is one of the very articulate people who has lived in so many different circumstances: fanatical Islam, fanatical atheism, and now very clear in her conversion to Christ. And it would be very interesting to see what impact that has. But it may be that the impact is measurable in terms of what you've been writing about, the return of faith in God. You've observed it all over the place.
This was the fascinating thing. You know, you very kindly wrote an endorsement for that book when it appeared in the summer of 2023, but it was only a few months later that Ian wrote that viral article titled "Why I'm Now a Christian."
Yes.
And essentially she had summarized in that article a lot of what I was saying.
Yeah.
In the book, that there had been an intellectual shift, that essentially the atheist story of reality just couldn't account for the things that people actually value and hold dear. And essentially she was saying in this article, I've come to realize that everything I hold dear about civilization, human rights, progress, freedom, equality, dignity, they didn't come from atheism, and they can't be sustained by a secular account.
And that's hugely important, because there are people, very bright people, I believe, coming in on that side and demonstrating that the values that most of us hold dear, actually don't come, as Tom Holland would say, from Greece and Rome. They come from Christianity. And that represents a polar shift, I think, in attitudes. And it has been a great pleasure to get to know Ian a little and to see the reality of what God has done in her life. It's a miracle in a sense.
And it's not just an intellectual change.
No, it isn't.
A very personal journey she's been on.
But then it's got to be. I often say when people raise this, that God is a person, not a theory. And relationship with him is, well, it's like this: an eagle requires 2 wings to fly. There is an intellectual side, but it's a relationship. And those two together are very powerful. And especially when someone has tried various alternative worldviews and really gone into them in a big way and discovers they don't deliver. That's a very popular phrase among politicians these days. We're going to deliver. And it doesn't deliver. And in coming to a genuine sense of Christianity and its truth and discovering that that delivers, has a very powerful voice for our modern society.
I wonder if we could change gears slightly and look at one of the key arguments that certainly the New Atheists made, and that probably is the one that stops most everyday people probably in their tracks when it comes to God and faith, and it's the problem of suffering.
Yes.
Something that you've written on,
I have.
spoken on, something that Ian, and most people are very familiar with in one form or another. I suppose everybody comes to that question in different ways and has different ways of solving the question. When you've been asked this particular question, how can a good, loving, all-powerful God allow the kind of suffering that inevitably we encounter in this world? Where do you begin with that question, John?
Where I begin depends on whether the person is thinking about suffering or actually suffering. Because the first demands, at least initially, an intellectual approach, whereas the second demands a pastoral approach. And the difficulty is, if you throw everything together and just think in terms of people who are watching suffering as distinct from those who are actually going through it, I think one fails to see first of all, how difficult it is. And I think this is the hard question. Without any argument, it is the hardest question any worldview faces, not only Christianity. So if it's the intellectual side, how can a good God, etc., 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 then I will ask philosophical questions. For example, where does their concept of goodness come from in the question? And there I go back to my Russian interests and recall Dostoevsky and the famous statement in the Brothers Karamazov, if God doesn't exist, then everything is possible. What he was saying there was that atheists, if you follow atheism to its logical conclusion, it seems to rule out the possibility of goodness because everything is arbitrary and there's no reason for anything at all. Everything's absurd. It's just come about by irrational, mindless forces and all the rest of it. Well, we know that in the sense that it's been rammed down our throats by the new atheists. Dawkins' famous statement that this universe is just like you'd expect it to be. It's a very well-worded statement. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music, more or less that. So that his atheism removes the concepts of good and evil. Now, if you stand there, you have a problem. Because why object to the evil in the world if actually you're talking about a non-existent category? So that's one thing. Now, I have a problem because I do believe in God still. And what I then begin to talk about is, first of all, atheism seems to have a huge philosophical problem. But when you come round to the situation of people who are actually suffering, I emphasize very strongly, I don't see simplistic answers, certainly not at the philosophical level. But then I come back to what I said earlier, Justin, that God is a person, not a theory. Now, you and I expect when we were undergraduates, we used to argue this Epicurus, David Hume talked about it, didn't he? Epicurus' old dilemma. If God is all powerful, he can't be all good, and so on. You mentioned that. And I never got a satisfactory answer to that midnight oil discussion. Now, as a mathematician, when we've tried a question for several hundred years and get nowhere, we try to change the question. And I came up with an alternative question, which is just as hard, but I think gets you further. And it's this. Granted that we face what I call a mixed universe, you could call it beauty and barbed wire, beauty and bombs. You know exactly what I mean. The beauty of the mountains and the sunset and the Mediterranean and the horror of Gaza. Every worldview has got to face that it's mixed. Every philosophy worthy of the name will have to face that. And here's my hard question, and it's this. Granted that it's like that, is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God whom we could trust with it? That's a hard question. But that, when it's put into the context of historic Christianity, brings me to the cross at the heart of Christianity, where we see God, if it means anything at all, if that is God on the cross, which is the claim of Christianity, God incarnate, he hasn't remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it. Now that's a start. It's not the solution. It's not a neat and simplistic answer, but it's a window through which people can look. And I've seen its effect on people again and again and again, that somewhere at the heart of this broken universe, there's a God that understands. And that would never have been noticed if he hadn't been raised from the dead on the third day. And that is what transforms my whole attitude to that and gives me hope. But it doesn't mean that the problem disappears. I'm going to live with all kinds of unsolved questions until the day I die, but I think there's enough evidence to trust Christ with this because he has suffered and because he's been raised from the dead, which means, if it's true, that God has broken the death barrier. And that is where I find my hope. Now, there's a great deal more to be said, as you know, but it seems to me, from a pastoral perspective, that helps people begin to reflect on something that can give them hope. I remember I went to New Zealand the same week as the earthquake. I had to change all my talks. Earthquakes, why? And I remember talking along these lines at one of the biggest congregations that have been seen in a Baptist church in Christchurch. And we had all kinds of warnings at the beginning about aftershocks and this. And I remember I finished and I went back to speak to the minister, and I was handed a note. And it simply said, I lost my husband in the earthquake earlier this week. This is the first thing I've heard that's given me any hope. And I thought, well, that's it. No simple answers. You know, when Jesus saw in the graveyard, and this story has lived with me, when Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, a little nuclear family, and Lazarus is dead, and Jesus doesn't turn up. And it almost causes them to doubt the love of God. If you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. They believed he could have cured him. And Jesus saw what death had done to that little family. He wept. And that can often get through. Where intellectualizing doesn't. And the interesting thing about that particular story is that you get both kinds. Mary was the person who was weeping and very upset. Martha was strong theologically. Your brother will rise again, said Jesus. Yes, I know he will at the last day, you see. She was a strong, intellectually robust person. And he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. And it's in that area, Justin, that I believe that we can put down roots, because death is the last enemy and people face it and they're afraid of it and they've no answer to it and they rationalize it. And in the contemporary world with AI, transhumanism, they're trying to battle against it technologically as hard as they can, when all the time there's available.
Well, I want to come back to technology AI. That's something you've been writing and thinking about a lot recently. But just to finish this conversation on suffering, and I love the way that you do talk about the need for not just an intellectual approach, but that pastoral approach, and the fact that this is when this becomes real is when people are in the midst of suffering, and the person of Christ is what we hold out, rather than just a theodicy, you know, because actually that's the thing that makes the difference. And I've always felt, in any case, you still have a problem of suffering if you remain an atheist. It's just that suffering is meaningless.
That's right.
It's a sort of...
You've no solution.
There's no solution to suffering. On the Christian level, it is a great mystery. It remains a great mystery, but there is a hope that there is some kind of we can make sense of it at some level, and that there's a person that we can cling to, if you like.
And it's hugely important. I mean, I can specialize. Within the last month, I heard a crash at 4 o'clock in the morning in a hotel. I went into the bathroom. My wife was lying on the floor, and I thought she was dead. And she then spoke, and there was a huge relief. But in those moments where I thought she was dead, I had complete peace that I'd see her again. And in my experience of these near-death experiences, if you like, both in my own case and hers, I have sensed that peace, and so has she. And that's what you'd expect if it's true.
Right. That's it. That's, in a sense, it's still a scientific thing. It's the empirical evidence that you need to show.
Of course it is.
So this works. This is True.
And it's important because coming back and wearing a scientific hat, people often say to me, look, you can't possibly buy into this Christianity stuff because Christianity is not testable. Of course it's testable. This is just what you've been referring to. If it didn't actually work in daily life, I would not be remotely interested.
And that's coming back to the story of Ayan, that we see again this tension between, obviously there's been an intellectual journey she's been on, but it was in the crux of her own despair, a meaning crisis really, that she's spoken of quite openly.
And therefore she's a very important spokeswoman
Yeah.
for this particular thing. And it's very real when you listen to someone who's been through it.
Yeah, and she as I understand it from listening to some of the interviews she's given about this, she was in despair, nihilistic.
Despair,
Gone through a number of counsellors and therapists. Only when one sort of challenged her to say, have you thought about praying? Because I think you're intellectually bankrupt is the way.
Spiritually bankrupt.
Spiritually bankrupt. Spiritually bankrupt. And she said, but I can't pray. I don't believe in God. The God I was raised with was a monster. And this person said, well, what kind of a God might you be willing to believe in? And Diane started to describe a God she might be willing to believe in and realized she was describing Jesus
It's amazing.
And then that seemed to be the key, sort of a person, Jesus, and praying and start trying, testing whether this thing could hold you. And suddenly the lights came on.
And it's a miracle. It is a miracle. And you see that her conversion through all these experiments, through all these experiences is immensely confirming to me, who haven't necessarily been through the same journey, but can see evidence of a person who's transformed their worldview now for a third time and come to rest in the truth of Christianity. It's extremely powerful.
Just as we begin to wrap up our conversation, John, you've referenced already, actually, you've been through some difficult times just recently with Sally, and I was so sorry to hear about that moment you had, but the peace that was evidently there as well. How do you, as you encounter increasingly, the fragility of life, the difficulties that come, and just the suffering that is inevitably part and parcel of all of our experience, where does your hope and how do you sustain yourself as you go into that?
I sustain myself by reminding myself very frequently of what is the key hope of Christianity. Hope's a very interesting concept. And as I understand it, it means expectation for the future. It refers to the future. And Doctor, is there any hope, is the question we ask. And the New Testament uses it a great deal. And one of the central statements is made by the Apostle Peter. We have been born again unto a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And there are several things in there, but one of them is the resurrection of Jesus is not merely a fact in history that has no implications. It means that we should take seriously his claim to be the Son of God, and he has promised. And this is where I rest my hope. He has promised to anyone like you or me who accepts that this is evidence that he is the Lord of creation and trusts him. And that's the key thing with their life, not trust their own effort or their own religion or whatever, but trust him for salvation as the one who's done something about it on the cross and in his resurrection. Then he says, I will raise you up, which is an incredible thing if it's not true. And the irony of it is, I have been, as you said, very interested in the hopes generated by the transhumanist movement, and in particular by Yuval Noah Harari in his book Homo Deus. And he's saying, well, 21st century is going to see two big things happen. One, the abolition of physical death, so that humans won't need to die, though they may die. And that'll be a medical thing because it's just a technical problem. And secondly, the enhancement of human happiness by bioengineering and all that kind of stuff. And when people come along to me with that, I smile at them and I say, you're too late. And they said, but we haven't got there yet. How could we be too late? I said, you're too late because the solution, the solving of the problem of physical death, if you put it in those terms, happened 20 centuries ago. It's there if only you had eyes to see it in the resurrection of Christ. And as for enhancing human happiness and uploading us into some kind of state where we will have a sort of eternal life, well, Jesus promises that. And I said, I'm looking forward to the greatest uploading in history. And there's more evidence to back it up than the transhumanist program.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that we have a substantial message, because the supreme irony of all of this is transhumanism is the attempt of humans to become gods. That's what Harari says. Whereas Christianity, at its heart, God becomes human so that he may open the way for us to become not gods, but to become children of God and enjoy his life eternally. There's a message here, you see, for the technological world of today.
Well, it's a good message for the place we're sitting just outside Oxford University, where many of these conversations are playing out, where many of these technologies are being developed. And the question ultimately of whether we can save ourselves through our own efforts, through technology. I suspect, I agree with you, John, that ultimately we need someone outside of us and our abilities to do that.
That's absolutely true. Jesus gave the solar system as a parable once, and many people have not noticed it. The disciples, and it's in connection with the story of Lazarus, and Jesus was away from where they lived, and he got a message that Lazarus was sick. And eventually he said, let's go to Judea again. And the disciples said, no, you're walking, you're suicidal. And he said this, and I've always found it very interesting. He said, are there not 12 hours in the day? If a person walks in the day, he or she sees the light of this world. But if they walk in the night, they can't see because the light is not in them. And it's as if Jesus was using the solar system as a massive parable to say, look, just as we sit here in Yarnton, we look out of the window, the world is radiated by a light that's way outside our world. And we are utterly dependent on the light outside our world. The same is true at a much deeper level. I am the light of the world, said Jesus. He that follows me shall have the light of life. You notice it's a moving light. And the trouble is, if I'm here and the light moves there, I'll end up in the dark. So the following of Christ as the light of life is, it seems to me, the exact opposite of the idea of religion, which is, I work out my own salvation. I do it my way. No, Christ has done it, and the key is to learn to trust him and follow him as the light of this world, and that light is very bright.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, John.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching. For more Thinking Faith, do subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to support my work, you'll get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get free signed copies of both my books too, and the chance for a regular catch-up with me. Again, the links are with the show info. See you next time.